Have you ever turned on the faucet without a second thought? Before water treatment plants and store-bought filters, families relied on their own ingenuity to make every sip safe. Today we're exploring 25 remarkable methods our grandparents used to purify drinking water that most of us have completely forgotten. Let's start with ceramic drip filters. If your grandparents lived on a farm or in a small town before the 1950s, there's a good chance one of these sat on their kitchen counter. A porous ceramic candle, made from diatomaceous earth and clay, was fitted inside a two-chamber stoneware container. You poured water in the top, and gravity pulled it through pores small enough to trap bacteria, sediment, and parasites. Clean water dripped into the lower chamber, where a spigot let you draw a glass. The Doulton Company in England made these starting in 1827, and Birkefeld filters from Germany were widely used in the United States by the late 1800s. A replacement ceramic element cost $1 or $2 and could be scrubbed clean dozens of times before it wore out. No cartridges to order, no electricity, no installation, just gravity, clay, and patience. It is remarkable that a technology from nearly 200 years ago works on the same principles as many high-end countertop filters sold today for hundreds of dollars. Boiling water on the wood stove. This was the most universal purification method in American history, and it was your grandmother's first answer whenever there was any doubt. If the creek ran muddy or a neighbor's well had gone bad, the response was always the same: put the kettle on. Boiling water for 1 full minute kills virtually all harmful bacteria, viruses, and parasites, and families knew this long before they understood germ theory. In the 1800s, public health officials distributed pamphlets urging families to boil all drinking water, especially during summer months when typhoid and cholera spiked. The wood stove was already burning, so keeping a pot at a rolling boil was simply part of the daily routine. Many grandmothers kept a dedicated kettle just for drinking water. After boiling, it was poured into a clean crock and covered with cloth to cool. The flat taste was a common complaint, so some families poured the cooled water back and forth between 2 pitchers to aerate it and restore flavor. Charcoal from the fireplace. Long before activated, charcoal became a trendy health ingredient. Families were using plain old charcoal from their fireplaces to clean drinking water. Charcoal is incredibly porous at a microscopic level, and those tiny spaces act like a sponge for impurities. When water passes through crushed charcoal, organic compounds and unpleasant tastes cling to the carbon surface. Families in rural Appalachia and across the Midwest commonly layered hardwood charcoal at the bottom of a bucket, then poured creek or well water through it. Hickory and oak were preferred for their dense, long-lasting charcoal. Some families made dedicated filters by boring holes in a bucket bottom, filling it with alternating layers of charcoal, sand, and gravel, and setting it over a clean collection vessel. The charcoal was replaced every few weeks, and since firewood was a constant in daily life, there was never a shortage of raw material. It cost nothing and worked remarkably well. Homemade sand filters. If charcoal was the carbon filter of the old days, sand filtration was the sediment trap. A wooden barrel with drainage holes near the bottom was filled with carefully arranged layers. Coarse gravel went at the very bottom, then smaller pebbles, coarse sand, and finally a thick layer of fine sand on top. Water poured in at the top percolated down through each layer, with the fine sand catching the smallest particles. The real magic happened over time. After a few weeks, a biological layer called the Schmutzdecke formed on the sand surface. This living mat of beneficial microorganisms actually consumed harmful bacteria as water passed through, making the filter more effective the longer it was used. Families who understood this knew not to disturb the top layer unnecessarily. When flow slowed to a trickle, they scraped off just the top half-inch and replaced it. Slow sand filtration was so effective that Philadelphia built one of the first municipal sand filtration plants in the 1800s, and it dramatically reduced typhoid rates. Before we move on, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you're enjoying this trip down memory lane, a like and a subscribe truly helps us continue making these videos for you. We really appreciate it. Cloth straining through feed sacks. Almost every rural household had a supply of cotton feed sacks that served 100 purposes beyond holding grain. One of the most common was water straining. When you drew water from a creek or shallow well, you poured it through several layers of tightly woven cotton stretched over the mouth of a jug. This caught visible debris like leaves, insects, and silt. Cloth straining alone did not kill bacteria, and most grandparents understood that. It was almost always a first step before boiling or charcoal filtering. In parts of Asia and Africa, folding cotton cloth into 4 or more layers was shown to reduce cholera bacteria by as much as 50% because the bacteria attached to particles in the water. American families did the same thing instinctively. Clean muslin or a well-worn flour sack, folded double, was the standard. Alum crystals. Here is one that many people have never heard of, but it was once as common as baking soda in the American household. Alum, or potassium aluminum sulfate, was a cheap mineral salt your grandparents could buy at any general store for just pennies. When you dropped a small piece into cloudy or murky water and stirred, something almost magical happened. The alum acted as a coagulant, causing all the tiny suspended particles to clump together into larger, heavier masses that sank straight to the bottom. This process is called flocculation, and it is still used in modern municipal water treatment plants today on a much larger scale. After letting the treated water sit undisturbed for an hour or two, you carefully poured the clear water off the top and left the settled muck behind. The water that came out looked practically pristine. Alum was particularly popular in the American South, where surface water ran red or brown from clay soils. A block the size of a walnut could treat dozens of gallons, and it kept indefinitely on the pantry shelf. Many families paired alum treatment with boiling or charcoal filtration for an extra layer of safety. Copper pots and pitchers. In many American households with roots in Europe or the Mediterranean, storing water in copper vessels was a tradition that went back generations. Grandmothers might not have known the science, but they knew water kept in a copper pitcher stayed fresher longer. Modern research confirms their observation. Copper has natural antimicrobial properties. Studies show that water stored in copper for as little as 16 hours had significantly reduced levels of harmful bacteria, including E. coli and Salmonella. The copper ions that leach into water in tiny amounts create an environment hostile to pathogens. This oligodynamic effect was not formally studied until the late 1800s, but families had benefited from it for centuries. Copper pitchers and water jugs were prized possessions, often polished to a warm glow and displayed in the kitchen. They cost more than tin or iron, which is why owning one carried a certain status. It was one of those cases where tradition and science aligned perfectly. Rainwater cisterns. Before municipal water systems reached every corner of America, millions of families depended on rain for their drinking water. Cisterns were massive collection tanks, often built from brick, stone, or concrete, positioned beneath the eaves to catch roof runoff. A typical cistern held 500 to 2,000 gallons. After a good rainstorm, the family was set for weeks. The key was what experienced families called the first flush. They let the first few minutes of rainfall wash dust and debris off the roof before directing flow into the cistern. Some rigged a pipe that diverted the initial dirty water away, then swung into the tank once the roof was rinsed. Inside the cistern, rainwater was remarkably clean since rain itself is essentially distilled. A tight lid kept out insects, and many families placed charcoal or copper at the bottom for extra protection. Which of these methods have you heard about from your own family? Share your story in the comments. Hand-dug stone-lined wells. There was a time when digging a well was one of the first things you did after claiming land. The process was backbreaking. A man dug straight down with a pick and shovel, often going 20 or 30 feet until hitting the water table. As he dug, the walls were lined with carefully stacked stones, bricks, or concrete rings to prevent collapse and keep surface water from seeping in. This lining was crucial. An unlined well invited runoff from barnyards, outhouses, and fields to trickle down and contaminate the groundwater. A properly lined and capped well drew water from deep underground, where it had been naturally filtered through soil, sand, and rock. The result was often water of excellent quality, cold and clear even in summer heat. Families built stone aprons around the top to direct rainwater away. A wooden or metal cover kept out animals. Well water was so valued that disputes over well placement were a regular feature of rural American life for centuries. The spring house. If you had a natural spring on your property, you had some of the cleanest water available without treating it at all. Spring water emerges after being filtered through layers of rock and earth, often over decades. It comes out cold, clear, and naturally pure. The spring house was a small stone or wooden structure built directly over the spring. Water was channeled through a shallow trough inside. Crocs of milk, butter, and eggs were placed in the flowing water, which kept them cold year-round before refrigeration existed. The building served double duty as water source and icebox. Temperatures inside hovered around 50 to 55 degrees, even on the hottest days. In Appalachia and across the rural South, spring houses were considered among the most valuable features of a homestead. Real estate listings well into the 1940s specifically mentioned a good spring. Some of these structures are still standing and still flowing today. Settling buckets and crocks. Sometimes the simplest methods were the most practical. If your grandparents drew water from a creek, the first step was often just letting it sit. They filled a large stoneware crock and set it in a cool, dark corner of the kitchen or on the back porch. Over several hours, gravity did the work. Dirt, clay, silt, and organic debris slowly settled to the bottom, leaving noticeably clearer water on top. This process of sedimentation did not kill bacteria, but it removed a tremendous amount of physical contamination. The clear water was carefully ladled or poured off the top into a clean container, leaving the muddy residue behind. Silver coins in the water jug. This sounds like an old wives' tale, but there is real science behind it. Many families, particularly in the South and frontier communities, dropped a silver coin into their water jug and left it there. The belief was that silver kept water pure and prevented it from going stale, and they were right. Silver exhibits the oligodynamic effect, meaning tiny amounts of silver ions are toxic to bacteria and algae. This property is powerful enough that NASA uses silver-based purification on the International Space Station today. Pioneer families heading west on wagon trains placed silver coins in their water barrels for the long journey. It would not remove sediment, but it significantly slowed bacterial growth and kept stored water drinkable much longer. A single silver dollar at the bottom of a ceramic crock made a measurable difference over days and weeks. Sunlight in glass jars. Your grandparents might have set glass jars of water on the porch railing or a south-facing windowsill. This practice had genuine purifying benefits. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun is a powerful disinfectant. Water placed in clear glass and exposed to direct sunlight for several hours receives enough UV to damage the DNA of bacteria, viruses, and parasites, rendering them unable to reproduce. This method, now formally recognized by the World Health Organization as SODIS, or solar water disinfection, works best with clear containers and relatively clear water. Turbid water blocks UV rays, which is why families often strained and settled water first before setting it in the sun. In the South and Southwest, where sunshine was abundant, this was a practical, cost-free method. Glass canning jars were the perfect vessel. Since every household had them, they were easy to clean, and they allowed maximum light penetration. About 6 hours of strong midday sun was generally enough. Clay pot storage. Long before refrigerators and plastic bottles, clay pots and earthenware crocks were the standard water storage vessels in millions of American homes. But these containers did more than simply hold water. Unglazed clay is naturally porous, and water stored inside continuously seeps through the walls and evaporates on the outer surface. This evaporation cools the remaining water inside by as much as 10 to 15 degrees below the surrounding air temperature. That cooler temperature slowed bacterial growth considerably and kept the water tasting fresh and pleasant. The porous nature of the clay also provided a mild filtering effect, trapping some sediment and impurities as water interacted with the vessel walls. In the American Southwest and across the rural South, a clay olla or water jug sitting in the shade of the porch was a common sight well into the 20th century. These pots were handmade from local clay by community potters and were surprisingly affordable. A well-made clay water pot was considered a household essential, right up there, alongside the cast-iron skillet and the wooden butter churn. Limestone rock beds. In parts of the country where limestone was abundant, particularly across the Midwest, the Ozarks, and Appalachia, families discovered that running water through broken limestone improved its quality. Limestone is primarily calcium carbonate. It neutralizes acidity, a common problem with surface water in forested areas where decaying leaves turn the water slightly sour. It also precipitates dissolved metals like iron and manganese that gave water a metallic taste and rusty color. Some families built simple limestone beds by filling a trough with crushed rock and pouring water through it. Others collected water downstream from natural limestone outcroppings, where the rock had already done the work. The water from limestone country was prized for its clean, slightly mineral taste. That same limestone filtered water gives Kentucky bourbon and Tennessee whiskey their distinctive character, a fact distillers have understood for generations. Have you ever tasted water straight from limestone country? Wooden barrel filters. The homemade barrel filter was a common fixture on American farms from the colonial era right through the early 20th century. The design was straightforward but surprisingly effective. You took an old oak or cedar barrel, drilled several small holes in the bottom, and filled it with carefully arranged layers of filtering material. Coarse gravel went at the very bottom, then a layer of smaller pebbles, then coarse sand, fine sand, crushed charcoal, and sometimes a final layer of clean cotton batting on top. Water poured in at the top, seeped slowly down through every layer, emerging from the bottom holes as significantly cleaner water. The barrel itself contributed to the process, since oak and cedar both contain natural tannins with mild antimicrobial properties. Families set the barrel up on a sturdy stand or bench with a clean bucket underneath to catch the filtered water. The whole apparatus was low cost, easy to build and maintain, and surprisingly effective at removing turbidity, organic matter, and even some bacteria. When the flow rate slowed down, you knew it was time to dump out the old sand and charcoal and pack it fresh. Apple cider vinegar. Every farmhouse pantry in America had a jug of apple cider vinegar, and it was used for far more than pickling and salad dressing. Many families added a generous splash of raw apple cider vinegar to their drinking water, believing it helped keep the water clean and provided general health benefits. While vinegar is not a reliable disinfectant at the concentrations typically added to drinking water, acetic acid its active component, does inhibit the growth of certain bacteria at higher concentrations. At the diluted levels used in everyday drinking water, its purifying effect was limited. However, it did help mask off flavors and made slightly stale or flat water taste noticeably fresher. Apple cider vinegar was especially popular because it was made at home in enormous quantities every fall when the apple harvest came in. Families with even a few apple trees produced gallons of the stuff, and it kept indefinitely in a cool pantry. Adding a tablespoon to a gallon of water was a widespread daily practice in rural New England, the mid-Atlantic states, and across the Upper South. Pine charcoal and resin. In heavily forested regions, particularly the Pacific Northwest and New England, families had an effective natural filtering material right outside their door. Pine charcoal was made by burning pine wood in a low-oxygen environment, and it was prized for filtration because of its extreme porosity. A chunk of pine charcoal has enormous internal surface area, and those microscopic spaces excel at trapping impurities. But pine offered a bonus. Pine resin has natural antimicrobial properties recognized for thousands of years. Some families added hardened pine resin to their charcoal filters for extra protection. Recent research has confirmed that compounds in pine resin, including abiotic acid, do exhibit antimicrobial activity against common bacteria. The combination of physical filtration from charcoal and chemical protection from resin made pine-based treatment surprisingly sophisticated for a method requiring nothing more than a walk in the woods and a fire. Halazone tablets. By the early 20th century, science began to formalize what families had been doing informally for generations. Halazone tablets, developed around 1910, were among the first commercially available water purification products marketed to the general public. These small white tablets contained a chlorine-based compound that, when dissolved in water, released enough active chlorine to kill most harmful bacteria and viruses. During World War I and World War II, Halazone tablets were standard issue in military canteens and first aid kits, and millions of returning soldiers brought the habit home with them into civilian life. A few drops of household bleach. This one might surprise you, but it was recommended by the American Red Cross and public health departments for decades. Adding a tiny amount of ordinary unscented household bleach to water is an effective emergency purification method. The standard recommendation was 2 drops of regular bleach per quart of water, or about 8 drops per gallon. After adding the bleach, you stirred the water and let it stand for at least 30 minutes. If you could detect a faint chlorine smell, the water was considered safe to drink. If you could not smell any chlorine at all, you added another small dose and waited again. Sodium hypochlorite, the active ingredient in household bleach, is the same basic chemical used by municipal water treatment plants across the country, just in a far more concentrated form. This method was widely promoted during the Great Depression and through both world wars, when disruptions to normal water supplies were common. Government pamphlets and civil defense manuals included bleach purification instructions as standard emergency guidance for every American family. The water crock with a spigot. Nearly every American kitchen from the 1850s through the 1950s had a large stoneware water crock sitting on the counter or on a wooden stand. These crocks held 2 to 5 gallons and featured a small brass or ceramic spigot near the bottom for dispensing. They were the predecessors of the modern office water cooler, and they served a real purification function beyond simple storage. The heavy ceramic walls kept water cool and dark, both of which slowed bacterial growth. Many families placed a piece of charcoal or a silver coin inside for additional protection. The spigot was positioned a couple inches above the very bottom, which meant that any sediment that settled out remained below the draw line and never made it into a drinking glass. When the crock was nearly empty, the remaining inch of water and the accumulated sediment were dumped out and the crock was scrubbed clean before refilling. Brands like Red Wing, Western Stoneware, and Robinson Ransbottom produced millions of these crocks, and today they are sought after by antique collectors. Diatomaceous earth filters. Diatomaceous earth, often called DE, is a naturally occurring powder made from fossilized aquatic organisms called diatoms. Under a microscope, each particle looks like an intricate honeycomb full of pores and channels. This structure makes it an extraordinarily effective filter medium. By the late 1800s, DE filters were being manufactured for household use. The Birkefeld filter, one of the most famous purification devices in history, used a ceramic candle made primarily from diatomaceous earth. These could remove bacteria as small as 1 micron. Remarkable for the era. Military field hospitals used Birkefeld filters during the Spanish-American War, and they were credited with dramatically reducing waterborne illness among troops. Household versions were affordable and available through catalogs. A single DE element could purify thousands of gallons before replacement, making it one of the most cost-effective purification methods ever developed. Potassium permanganate. If your grandparents had a bottle of dark purple crystals tucked away in the medicine cabinet or under the kitchen sink, it was very likely potassium permanganate. This powerful oxidizing agent was one of the most versatile chemical compounds in the American household for well over a century. When a few crystals were dissolved in water, they turned it a vivid pink or purple color. As a water purifier, potassium permanganate worked by oxidizing organic contaminants and killing bacteria and viruses on contact. It was particularly effective against iron and manganese, which were common and frustrating problems in well water across the Midwest and Great Plains. A tiny amount went a long way, since you only needed enough to turn the water a light pink. If the color faded quickly, that meant the permanganate had been consumed reacting with contaminants, and you simply added a bit more. Once the water held a faint pink tint for at least 30 minutes, it was considered properly treated. The compound was inexpensive, stored easily for years, reading the land for clean water. This was perhaps the most important skill of all, requiring no equipment whatsoever. Your grandparents knew how to read the landscape to find clean water. They knew fast-moving rocky streams were safer than stagnant ponds. Water sourced upstream from human or animal activity was less likely contaminated. They looked for hillside springs indicating deep, naturally filtered groundwater. They avoided water downstream from farms, tanneries, or mines. They watched for aquatic life, since a creek full of fish and crawdads was a good sign, while a lifeless waterway was a warning. They knew to avoid the blue-green scum of algae blooms. They tested water by smell, taste, and appearance before committing. This knowledge was accumulated over generations of hard experience, including painful lessons, passing it all down by word of mouth. If one thread ties every method on this list together, it is how the knowledge was shared. There were no tutorials or forums in your grandmother's day. Everything she knew about keeping water safe, she learned from watching her own mother. A young bride moving to a new farm learned from her mother-in-law which springs were safe. A father teaching his son to dig a well explained why the stone lining mattered. Communities shared knowledge about which creeks were reliable and which had made someone sick years ago. This oral tradition was humanity's original instruction manual, refined by trial and error over countless generations. Every ceramic filter, every charcoal-packed barrel, every maintained cistern represented knowledge someone took time to teach. And the remarkable thing is how much turned out to be scientifically sound. Our grandparents may not have known the words bacteria or oligodynamic, but they understood the principles through observation and a deep respect for the water that kept their families alive. Among all 25 of these methods, which surprised you most? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for joining us on this trip down memory lane. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and share it with a friend who remembers the old ways. And don't forget to subscribe.